Hello, everyone. My name is Dave Munger, and I'm a librarian with Sacramento Public Library. Welcome to this month's genealogy workshop, What Did Daddy Do? Locating Family Members in Old Business Records, Part 1, with our speaker, Madeline Yanov. Today's session will be recorded and available on our YouTube channel indefinitely. I'll put the link to our YouTube channel in the chat. Again, for questions about future genealogy presentations or to receive a copy of the handout, please email contact@saclibrary.org. I'll also post a copy of the handout to the chat for download. Now I'd like to introduce today's speaker, Madeline Yanov. Madeline Yanov, the owner of Time Travel Genealogy, has more than 30 years of genealogy experience, specializing in American research. Since most Americans are descendants of immigrants, she is very familiar with European genealogy, specifically Irish, British, the Slovak region, and Russian, with a little German on the side. She has also been instrumental in locating and helping reunite adoptees with their birth parents. In her other life, before becoming a full-time genealogist, Madeline was a paralegal whose expertise included the discovery for cases. This experience helped her in genealogy to analyze what to search for and how to find it. She has a degree in history and political science and uses those disciplines to tell the stories of her clients' ancestors. Madeline believes that genealogy is more than just names and dates. It's the stories behind our ancestors' lives that make them real to us. She was a weekly volunteer at the Oakland, California Regional Family History Center until May 2023. Since 2011, she has been an indexer with FamilySearch.org. In 2012, Madeline was elected to the board of directors of the Contra Costa County Genealogical Society and is currently the president emeritus of that society. She also represents the Contra Costa County Genealogical Society and the Sacramento Regional Genealogical Council and the East Bay, North Bay Genealogy Networking Group. In addition to being a member of various local genealogical societies, she is a member of the Association of Professional Genealogists. Madeline loves traveling, meeting people, hearing their family stories, and sharing her love of history and genealogy with anyone interested. Her presentation today is What Did Daddy Do? Locating Family Members in Old Business Records, Part 1. Thank you for joining us, Madeline. I will pass the virtual mic to you now.
Thank you, David, for that nice introduction. Hello, everyone. How are you? My name is Madeline Yanov, and I'm very happy to be here with you today to talk about occupational records. All right, let's see if we can go that. We're going to look at occupational records and the business records that were created around them. And for some reason, my screen is not sharing. Well, this is a two-part talk, and today's subject is going to be where people's occupations are found and what records exist for them. Now, let's try this again and see if we can come back and do this. Okay.
Okay, I see it now.
Okay, but it's just not showing up on the screen.
End of slideshow.
This is why you do rehearsals beforehand.
Yeah, and it was working.
It was, I know, yeah, it was working. Yay! I love it when technology works.
Yeah, excellent.
So anyway, as I was saying, the subject is occupations and the business records that are found with those occupations. And the information for today's talk is generally enough that it should be able to apply to everyone, no matter what their occupation was. Part 2 is going to focus on specific occupations like mining, railroads, assembly lines, unions, and so on. Well, I'm going to let you in on a little confession. I actually don't know what I was thinking of when I created the title for this talk, but the title is wrong. The idea of the stay-at-home mom is a rather recent idea, basically from the 1940s onward. Before that, women worked in the house and outside of it. From alongside their husband on the family farm, assisting their husband in their dry goods business, working as her husband's nurse in his practice, and having side jobs, such as taking in laundry or sewing to make extra money. Many times, women were the breadwinners of the family. You know, such as those that worked in the airplane factories in World War II because their men were overseas. In my brother-in-law's family, grandmother was the breadwinner because his grandfather would disappear for years, come back just long enough to get her pregnant, and then disappear again. So she had to work to support 4 children. So women's occupations are just as important as the men. So the title of this talk really should be, What Did Daddy and Mommy Do? Locating Family Members in Old Business Records, Part 1. For those of you that have not heard any of my talks before, I give a lot of information. These talks are a crash course in the subject. Actually, I think you're lucky that the Sacramento Public Library is taping these because now you can go back and review it again and again if needed. Now, business records have always existed, but we don't recognize them as genealogical sources. And so as a result, they're easy to overlook. Governments have consistently issued permits and licenses for businesses to operate, and then they've taxed those businesses. Since the Middle Ages, guilds and trade unions have regulated members' activities and also maintained records. In the United States, all publicly owned companies are required to produce an annual report, which is available to the public. So records exist. You just need to know where to find them. And it's also important to know that these records can be valuable sources of information for genealogists. What we're going to cover today is finding your ancestor's occupation. How do you even know what they did? And what records are going to tell us their occupation? Once we know what their occupation was, then we can determine if they worked for a business or if they were in business for themselves. And that will end up helping us look for the records. You're going to find out that there are specialized types of business records. You've got your professional licenses. You've got business formation records and corporations. You've got small business records. And you can also find information about a business and its employees in business publications, such as trade journals, business directories, and company newsletters. We're then going to find the sources for these records, and I'm going to end up giving you some tips and things to remember when searching for occupations and business records. So where can you find information on occupations? Well, start with the censuses. All the censuses from 1840 onward asked questions about people's occupations. In 1840, they asked questions about how many people were involved in agriculture. The 1850 census asked about specific occupations. In 1910, they asked about specific industries. And the 1940 census asked, how many hours a week did you work? How many weeks in the last year did you work? And what were your wages? Now remember, this was at the tail end of the Depression. State censuses are also going to be asking similar questions. So don't forget about checking state censuses. You're going to find occupations listed in city directories, and we're going to go through every one that's on this list during the talk. You're going to find the occupation and the employer listed. Draft registration cards listed occupations. The draft registrations for the Civil War, for World War I and World War II asked these questions. You can find information on somebody's occupation in their enlistment papers. Newspapers are going to have articles about businesses, obituaries, legal notices, and advertisements. County histories many times listed a person's occupation. You're also going to have the occupation listed in many cases for a groom on a marriage record, and then also on death records, whether it's the death certificate or the obituary. Tax records and voter registers also can list occupations. And then finally, immigration and naturalization records are going to list your occupation. What we have on this screen, the top image, is an image for Proctor's Motors. That is from the city directory. Now, if your ancestor was in the car business, you might be able to locate his ad in the city directory. William Honeyworth from East Cambridge, Massachusetts, had an ad in the local newspaper. Here he advertised what he sold: goods from the West Indies, family groceries, glass, stoneware, crockery, and he gives his address. So you can find information about people's occupations in their businesses just in something simple like ads. So let's start with censuses. We have two censuses on this slide. 1870 federal census for Piatt County, Illinois, for William Phelan. William is one of my ancestors. Now, in the top image, he is a 14-year-old boy, and he's listed as working as a farmer. He's in the household of his father, also named William, who had a farm in Piatt County. Now, it makes a lot of sense that a 14-year-old boy, is going to help work on the family farm. So that gives us an idea of what he was doing in 1870. But even though an occupation is listed on one census, you can't assume that it's going to be the occupation for life. You have to check all the censuses to see if people change jobs. And sure enough, on the second image, we have William. He's grown up. He's moved away to McLean County. He has a family. And he's now listed as being an ice dealer. So in the 30 years that transpired between the two censuses, he changed jobs. What was the reason for changing those jobs? You might want to find out what prompted him to leave farming. Now, ice dealers in those days, they would take big blocks of ice that had been cut up in the winter and distribute them to all the customers on their route to put in their ice boxes, which literally were boxes that would hold ice that would keep your food fresh. And in the wintertime, he would also distribute coal. So this tells me what William was doing at two different phases of his life. Now, most censuses and for state censuses will have similar information. And all the states had censuses with the exception of 9. They are Kentucky, Vermont, New Hampshire, Pennsylvania, Ohio, Connecticut, West Virginia, Idaho, and Montana. Those states never had state censuses. All the rest had state censuses. So you can find occupations there. Once we find out what someone does in the census, we want to look at city directories. Now, this is the 1895 Bloomington City Directory for Mr. Phelan. The image on the left shows that he works in ICE, and it gives his wife's name, and it also gives his residence. Now, city directories not only just had information about the people that lived there, they also had a section for businesses, sort of the combination of like white pages, yellow pages combined. And in the back, under the businesses, we notice that he is considered an ICE dealer. Now, his address is 108 South Main. That's his place of employment. But 108 South Main is the Arctic Ice Company. Now, they're a wholesaler. If he worked as an employee there, he would not be listed separately under ice dealers. What William was an independent contractor working for Arctic Ice. Now, if I just had that particular bit of information, I could start to look for information on his occupation. I would first check Arctic Ice, see if it's still in business. And if it wasn't, check to see who bought it. And then I would check with the County Historical Society for more information. If your ancestor was a business owner, look for advertisements in the directory. Ancestry and MyHeritage have large collections of city directories. And if you want a physical copy, you contact a large public library, such as the Sacramento Public Library or the County Historical Society for physical copies. You're going to find information about occupations in military records. Now, during the Civil War, men from the ages of 20 to 45 were required to register for the draft. And one of the things they asked was, what was your occupation? The image on the left, and I apologize, it's dark, but that was the best available image, is for John Phelan from Yates County, New York. And he registered for the draft, and his occupation was laborer. Now, there were 3 drafts held in World War I between 1917 and 1918, and all men from the ages of 18 to 45 were required to register. And in this particular one, they asked not only your occupation, but your employer. And we have in the middle image, John Phelan, who is one of my grandfathers. He registered for the draft in Bloomington, Illinois, and his occupation was given electrical and mechanical instructor. And he worked for the Greer College of Motoring. Now, this is 9 years after the Model T was introduced. People needed to be trained in order to fix these cars, both as a mechanic or if you just wanted to know for your own personal knowledge. And so my grandfather would teach people how to fix their Model Ts and other cars. Now, fast forward to World War II. In 1942, men between 45 and 64 who were not already in the military were required to register. This is called the old man's draft. Not that they figured that they'd be drafting 55-year-olds, but if you had a specific knowledge about something, or if you worked for a specific company, the government needed to know. John registered for the draft for a second time. And this one, they had asked, who do you work for? And he wrote down that he was working for National Tea Company. Now, if you're from the Chicago area, or if you spent some time in Chicago, the National Tea Company was a chain of grocery stores, sort of like Safeway. And so that we know that he had made a career change from instructing people on how to fix their cars to working for the National Tea Company. Now, registrations cards for both world wars are found on Ancestry and Family Search. MyHeritage has the World War II cards. And Ancestry also has a consolidated collection of Civil War draft records, mainly for the Union, though. You can also find occupations and employers' names listed on people's enlistment and discharge papers. In his enlistment papers, I found out that my dad worked in the mailroom of an oil company right out of high school. Now, I was born and raised in Chicago. It's like, what oil companies are in Chicago in the 1940s? Houston, I could see, but Chicago, not so much. So it wasn't until I got his discharge papers from World War II that the employer Standard Oil was identified. Now I had a name to start my research. So make sure you look at all types of military records, both the registration cards and also the enlistment and discharge papers. You're going to find information about people's occupations in newspapers. We're going to see articles about businesses. If your ancestor was injured on the job, let's say in a large fire or an explosion or so on, that would be listed in the newspaper. If your ancestor was a member of a labor union and they went on strike, that's going to be listed in the newspaper. Retirements of people that have been at a company for a long time could be listed. And also classified ads about open positions are also going to be in a newspaper. Newspapers also have obituaries. And you're going to find information in an obituary, not a funeral notice, about an occupation or an employer of the person that died. Sometimes the groom's occupation or employer is listed in the newspaper in a marriage announcement. And any advertisement for the business or any sales could list your ancestor, especially if they were the owner. You are going to find most of these newspapers, the online newspapers, and the online databases like Genealogy Bank, newspapers.com, Chronicling America, so on. Your major newspapers are going to be found in state and public libraries and county historical societies. Now, county histories are good for finding prominent persons. They're sort of a who's who at the time. And they're also good for finding settlers to that county and early pioneers. What they will have is biographies of people, especially prominent people in a certain area at that time. But you have to be careful using county histories because many times people's lives were exaggerated. And sometimes people paid for articles to be written about them. So you have to take it with a grain of salt. Here we have John Phelan. This is the one whose Civil War draft card that we saw. He's listed as a substantial man and extensive farmer of Piatt County. Now that could be hyperbole, but it really was true because he worked for several different large farmers, and the bio names them, and he ended up amassing a fortune himself and had many people working under him. So these are a good place to start. But again, you have to take it with a grain of salt because it's not just reporting. Marriage records can also, depending upon the time, tell you what someone's occupation was. Here we have William Phelan's marriage to Nancy Wilson. William Phelan is the ice dealer. And they got married in 1884. The image on the left is their marriage license. But that's page 1 of 2 pages. If you just stop at page 1, you're going to miss page 2, which is the one that has his occupation. He was a farmer. And actually, this record can sort of help us narrow the amount of time that he was a farmer before he became an ice dealer. In 1900, he was an ice dealer, but in 1884, he was still a farmer. So he made the switch sometime between the last 15 years of that century. So as with many other records in genealogy, you always have to make sure you look at both pages. We're used to death records giving us information about occupations. The one on the left is a copy of the death certificate for my grandfather, John Phelan. And in it, he is listed as being an electrician working for the National Tea Company. Now, if you die while you're working, your death certificate is going to give the name of your employer and your occupation. If you're retired, they will list the last known employer. And in this particular case, his last known employer was National Tea Company. Now, this correlates with the information I found on the record for his draft registration. Excuse me. Employee obituaries are also going to tell you what your ancestor did and who the employer was. The one on the right is for John Seelip. John Seelip is one of my husband's grandfathers. This is a good genealogy obituary. It lists all the survivors, where they're from, and so on, but it doesn't tell me what he did. It doesn't say anything about his employer or his occupation. Excuse me. But in going down the article a little bit, I see that he's a member of several different groups. And one of the groups that he was a member of is the UMW of A. That stands for the United Mine Workers of America. And it gives the chapter local and tells where it's out of. It comes out of Maxwell, Pennsylvania. I would be able to look at UMW archives for records about John Seelip. Because this paper, the obituary came out of the Uniontown, Pennsylvania paper, and he was a member of the UMW out of Maxwell, Pennsylvania. This tells me, look around for the mines that are in that area. And you might be able to get extra information too. So sometimes obituaries can give you information without actually stating the obvious. You're going to find occupations in tax records. The top image shows the Internal Revenue's tax record for Washington, D.C. in 1864. And the box highlights Abraham Lincoln, who is listed his occupation as president. It lists his residence, the White House, and it gives what his income was and what the tax on that was. Now, to the left is a little notation that was added later on about his assassination in 1865 and the amount of tax that had incurred up to that point. On the bottom image, we see 1800 taking record Now, a taking record is sort of a tax record. For Boston, Massachusetts, Ward 2. And here we find Thomas Stevenson, who is a constable. So you can find information about people's occupations in tax records. Going along with that, you can also find them for voting registers. Now, not all voting registers list an occupation, but you might get lucky and find one. These images are from the California Great Register for Nevada County. And you see the occupations that are listed, you know, laborer, merchant, farmer, saloon keeper. And my favorite, Einfeld Jurgen, who lists himself as a capitalist. Now, you may laugh, but a capitalist is an actual occupation. That was an occupation at that time. A capitalist was not a banker, but it was someone that dealt with money. He was an investor. So Einfeld Jurgen was an investor. If he was my ancestor, that would prompt me to look for companies in the area that he lived or the area that he was from to see if there's any relationship between him and those companies. So you can get information from voting registers. Now, many passenger lists listed occupations, and this is especially true of the later documents rather than the earlier passenger lists. The image on the left is of one of my great-grandfathers, Adam Weber, and his family. They immigrated from England to New York City in 1878, and Adam was a tailor. The image on the right is one of my husband's grandfathers petition to become a citizen in 1928. And he was a miner from Slovakia, and he remained a miner in the Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania area. So you can see two totally different records dealing with immigration and naturalization, but they're both going to have your occupation listed. So now sort of let's transition over to business licenses. Businesses needed a license to operate, and so did certain individuals. And this might come from the county or the city that they were in. Most professional licenses are going to be issued by state agencies, such as the ones that are listed on this slide. Now, as I said, most businesses need a license to operate. Every single business you interact with in your life will probably have a business license. Now, I've just listed a couple that you may have frequented or been exposed to in your life. There are many, many more. But if you go to an antique dealer, he's going to need a business license. If you take your kids to the carnival or the circus, they have to have a business license to operate. The man that tows your car is going to have a business license. Now, here's one I hadn't thought about until I did some research. Flea market booths, they have to also be licensed. Your tree trimmer is going to have a license. The grocery store that you shop in is actually going to have multiple licenses. Same with the maid or carpet cleaning service, or the person that takes care of your animals, or the taco truck that's there to give you lunch. They have to have a license. Pawnbrokers do, bars and saloons and restaurants do. In fact, they have to have multiple licenses because they have to pass inspection from health departments. Your hair and nail salons, massage parlors, dry cleaners, department stores, resale clothing. Goodwill has to have a license to operate. Barbers do too. So every company or person you interact with that sells you a service or a good is going to have a business license. Now, businesses' licenses are good for genealogy information, and this is going to depend upon the state, but you can find in these applications, you can find a person's age, their birth date, maybe their residence, possible former residence, their marital status, education, etc. So if you can find a business license, then you have a good chance of getting some extra information. Usually they're issued by the city or county that the business is in. So you're going to find them in city archives or historical societies. Now, sometimes they're held by the state. The Pennsylvania State Archives has tavern licenses from the mid-1700s to the mid-1800s. And they also have peddler licenses for the city of Philadelphia. Sometimes the federal government issues licenses. Now, this is especially going to be true for operators of marine vessels. You would look in the National Archives for those. If your ancestor ran a tugboat business, if he was a tugboat operator in New York Harbor, he would need a license from the Coast Guard, hence the connection to the federal government. He would also need a license from the state of New York and possibly an additional license from the city of New York. So check in multiple jurisdictions to see if you have found all of these licenses. They're all going to be asking similar questions, but there's going to be some variation. The licenses, the general business licenses, are going to be renewable annually, depending upon the state. Some states will have it every 2-3 years. Most states will have a business license renewed every year. So you have multiple chances of finding your ancestor's business license. Now, if your ancestor did not renew within the prescribed time, the business and any service or work done was considered unlicensed. So let's talk about professional licenses. I'm going to talk about just 3 today: medical licenses, legal licenses, and accounting licenses, CPAs. Doctors required licenses, as did nurses, dentists, pharmacists, morticians, chiropractors, and mental health professionals. All professional licenses are issued by the state. Now, you're going to be able to find them in state archives or historical societies. Sometimes they're available in the county clerk's office. Now, in some cases, a large city may actually issue licenses. I have found the St. Louis Board of Pharmacy had licenses for about 10 years around 1900. Now, large professional organizations like the AMA archives have information on doctors. The AMA archives has over 350,000 doctors, going back as far as 1804. Family Search also has records of AMA doctors. These are the ones that died between 1874 and 1970. You also can find information about your ancestor that was a doctor in regional directories. The Family Search Library has the Minnesota and Wisconsin Regional Directory, which was published in 1890. They have that in their collection. What I've shown you on this screen is the Regional Medical Directory that was published by the Greenville, Tennessee Sun, and that was for this year. I've looked at that. In it, you're going to find a list of all healthcare professionals in that area, and then they're divided according to category. So you'll have all the pediatricians listed, all the cardiac surgeons listed, all the hospitals listed. So this is another way you can possibly find information about your ancestor. Excuse me. I also want to advise you, don't overlook any possible source, even sources that you don't think would have information about your ancestor. The DeKalb, Missouri County Clerk's Office has chiropractic licenses from 1927. Now, this is not in the state archives. It's in the county clerk's office. They also have embalmer licenses for 12 years. Also, not in the Historical Society, but in the clerk's office. Excuse me. I'm recovering from a cold. Anyway, so don't overlook any possible source. Lawyers also had to be licensed. You look for records in the American Bar Association archives or the State Bar Association archives, but you can also find them in the county clerk's office or the state library. Now, most cities, counties, and states have books called the bench and bar of whatever the locality is. Here we see the bench and bar of Texas. What this is going to do is list local attorneys and judges with the dates of their death and the ages they were when they died. And these are going to be found in most major public libraries where your ancestors practice. So I would not be surprised if you find these in the reference section at the Sacramento Public Library. Now, if you don't know where your ancestor practiced, you can go to the nearest law library and get a copy of the Martindale Hubbard Law Directory. And this has been around since the 1860s. And it will tell you where your ancestor practiced in Texas or in California. And there'll also be other books on area attorneys. So these are places where you can start to look for your ancestor who was a lawyer. If your ancestor was a CPA, they are going to be licensed by a department or agency of the state. In California, it's the California Board of Accountancy. Now, they have a professional organization, just like the doctors do, and it's called the AICPA. It's been around since 1887, and that organization has archival information on its members. Another place to look for records of your CPA ancestor is to find out if the firm that they worked for was still in existence. If it's still in existence, perhaps you can contact them and check their archives. If your ancestor worked in government accounting, you're going to want to check the Library of Congress. Also, universities and historical societies will have archival information. You're going to find out where your ancestor worked by looking in city directories or reading local newspapers or trade publications. Now, we're going to talk about a little bit about business formation and business records. all existing companies, well, actually, I should say all companies, but if a company is existing right now, they will had to have been incorporated with the state Secretary of State that they're headquartered in. So if your ancestor worked for a company that was headquartered in Delaware, they're going to be incorporated in Delaware. So you would go and you could go online and look on that Secretary of State's website or contact them about archival information. And the Secretary of State also is going to list the agent that's authorized to receive legal documents. So even though your ancestor worked in Delaware, maybe they were doing business in Pennsylvania, and it lists the name of the person or the company that was authorized to accept legal documents on behalf of the company. So you want to also check Dun & Bradstreet's $1 Million Directory. This is going to be at libraries. Excuse me. And this will tell you information about the incorporation. Now, what happens if the company your ancestor worked for merged or they were absorbed by another company? You can check Dun & Bradstreet's America's Corporate Families, and that outlines the relationship between various different companies. Let's say your ancestor worked for Macy's. Well, what's the relationship between Macy's and Federated Stores? Federated Stores bought out Macy's. You want to know this stuff so you can figure out where to go look for your ancestors' records. Now, what happens if they're no longer in business? Well, I would check Fisher's Manual of Valuable and Worthless Securities or Moody's investor manuals, and these are usually found in large libraries. Now, again, this is for corporations. You're also going to get information about the business in trade journals and company histories. And actually, you can find some information on the internet. Now, if your ancestor worked for a small company or a medium-sized company, you can use city directories to track changes from year to year and location to location. City directories are really good for small businesses. And speaking of small businesses, families and businesses have been linked throughout America's history. You have colonial era farms, you've got industrial robber barons. Families have really been the major force behind businesses in America. It's been estimated that in the 1950s and 60s, nearly 75% of all American businesses were run by families. Now, in recent years, family-owned businesses still make up about 80% of all businesses, but these are usually small and medium-sized businesses. As far as corporations go, family-run corporations, like the Waltons owning major stock in Walmart, that's about 30%. So there has been a connection between families and small businesses ever since the colonial days. So where do we find information? Well, you're first going to look on the census records from 1850 onward. That's going to give a hint as to what the person did, and maybe they worked in a small business. Then you go to the city directories, and we've already talked about that. Just remember that the city directories had the classified business section that organized businesses by categories, not necessarily by names. And they also included trade-related organizations A lot of times fraternal organizations grew up around people's occupations. And these are going to be found in your major public libraries, ancestry.com and Internet Archives. So I'm sure you're going to be able to find a lot of city directories in the Sacramento Public Library for the area around Sacramento. You're going to find information about small businesses in the county clerk's office, because there you will have the business licenses, and there people had to pay taxes for their business. And these are going to be found in courthouses or state archives. The Family Search Library also has a collection. Sanborn maps are good for finding small businesses because they're going to give you the type of building that your ancestor worked in, you know, what it was made of and where it was located in comparison to other buildings. You're going to find the Sanborn maps in, again, large libraries, and also online. ProQuest digital Sanborn maps have most of them. Newspapers, again, you're going to find information about ads, openings, closings, help wanted, business articles, and so on. These are going to be on the newspaper collections online. Or if you want to have the actual newspaper itself, you can do it in by going to see local libraries or historical societies. So let's now briefly discuss business communications, because this is actually where you may find extra information about your ancestors' work. This includes business directories, trade magazines, and company newsletters. Business directories have employee listings. Now, some are going to include the name of key employees or managers or supervisors. So if your ancestor was a supervisor, they might be listed. Business directories also are going to tell you details of the company and the actual location. So if your ancestor worked for a company and they had multiple locations, this will tell you a little bit about a particular location. And positions and occupations. Some employees were listed by their roles or their departments that they were in. This is especially true of large corporations. Now, if the directory includes an address or a job title, you can cross-reference that with other records like census records or employment records or union registries. A lot of large libraries and historical societies have digitized their business directories, and so it's easier to find these now. But you can check WorldCat for libraries that are close to you. And if you want the actual physical directory, check your local historical society or the society in the county where your ancestor worked. So let's say I am looking for a business directory that I believe is going to have information about my ancestor. He worked for Ford Motor Company in 1915. Where do I start? Well, I would start at the local library. The local library meaning the Detroit Public Library. The Detroit Public Library has an automotive collection. Then I would check the University of Michigan Library. That also is going to give information about business directories. The Library of Congress also has a collection of business and city directories. I would not forget historical societies like the Detroit Historical Society, or maybe the Henry Ford Museum, because they may have information that I need from a business directory. I mean, it's a given that I'm going to check genealogy websites like Ancestry and Family Search, but I'm also going to check state archives. The Michigan State Archives also has business directories. So as you can see, a lot of these different places will have a business directory that I can access and find out information from about my ancestor. Trade magazines are another good way to find information about your ancestor and their employment or occupation. A trade magazine is a publication designed for individuals interested in a specific industry or trade. Now, it's going to have articles, case studies, industry trends, in addition to advertisements for services and technologies that are related to that field. You are going to find trade magazines in public and university libraries and archives. You can also find trade magazines in online databases like JSTOR, ProQuest, or EBSCO. EBSCO is a collection of business magazines and publications. You'll have some luck finding a trade magazine in trade association archives. eBay and other marketplaces may have vintage trade magazines. I've seen them. You might want to try a specialty bookstore, one that specializes in out of print or hard to find books. It would be the same for magazines. You also can find trade magazines on Google Books and Internet Archive. And here's an idea. Network online. Join a forum to connect with others interested in that particular company or that particular field. Now, just to give you an idea what a trade magazine is like, I'm going to show you what some genealogy trade magazines are like. And I think you're going to be very surprised at what they are. They're not as technical as you think. I am sure most of us have at least one of these. Family Tree Magazine is considered a trade magazine. Internet Genealogy. For those that want something a little bit more scholarly, the New England Historical and Genealogical Register, or maybe the APG Quarterly. The National Genealogical Society Quarterly is considered a trade magazine, as are some newsletters that are put out by large genealogy groups. These are all trade magazines. So keep that in mind when you're thinking about trying to find a trade magazine that could describe the company that your ancestor worked for or the company that they owned, because it's basically anything that deals with that field or trade. Oops. Now this is one of my favorites, company newsletters. A company newsletter was an internal way for the management to inform, share, engage, and connect with their employees. They could share company news, what's happening to the company, or milestones that they've reached. Maybe announcement, they're getting a new chairman of the board, or so-and-so has been promoted to first vice president. Engage with the employees, they provide employee recognition. Feedback, training practices. You're going to find that this is where they're going to tell about two employees that happen to fall in love and get married, or somebody's retiring. It's also a way to connect employees and management by team bonding and reinforce company values. You are going to find newsletters in company archives, historical societies, and the Hagley Digital Archives. Now, this is really cool. I sort of found that by accident, but I was looking for the Avon News, which we have a copy on the slide. I was looking for a specific issue, the March 1983 issue. Well, I could not find the March 1983 issue, so I had to settle for May as an example. But my father-in-law used to work for Avon in the Chicago area. And he was a supervisor, and he had worked for Avon for quite a few years, and he decided to retire in 1983, in March of 83. So they had a little write-up about him, telling people that, he had been with the company for so many years, this is what he did. And they asked him what his plans were, questions like, do you have any particular hobbies or interests that you wanted to work on? Or does your wife have a long honey-do list? Or are you planning on doing a lot of traveling? Well, it turns out that my father-in-law did say he wanted to do a lot of traveling because at that time, he was going to end up welcoming 3 new grandbabies within the space of 6 weeks. My son was number 2. 3 weeks before him, my husband's sister-in-law gave birth to one of my nieces. And 3 weeks after my son was born, my husband's twin sister gave birth to another of my nieces. So here people found out that not only was Joe Yanov retiring from working at Avon for about 30 years, but his family was going to increase by 3 new persons, all within the space of 6 weeks. So you can find a lot of good information about your ancestor in these company newsletters. And this is sort of a way to give a more personal touch rather than just, dry facts. So now that we know what we're looking for, where do we find it? Well, the sources for finding businesses and records start at the home. What you have at home, whether it's a pay stub or paperwork or even artifacts, can point to a certain business. Records in the city and county offices are going to include licenses and taxes. The Secretary of State is going to have records on incorporation for companies. You can find a lot in court records. Perhaps your ancestor or their business was involved in a lawsuit, or there was a dispute, maybe over workman's comp. If your ancestor owned a business and they died, maybe the disposition of the business is going to be decided in probate. Or if a husband and wife owned a business and they got divorced, what happens to the business? You're going to find that in a court record. Sometimes property records are entwined with a business, so that might be listed. And you may also find your ancestor listed in criminal or, and I see I have a typo here, that should be civil cases. That's going to be listed in the court record. So there's a lot of court records that could apply to your ancestor's business. You're also going to find information in county historical societies, state archives, and libraries. You're going to find the name of employers in city directories. Sanborn maps are going to give you the structure of the building and the location of the business that your ancestor owned. Local newspapers, I think we've already discussed what we find in the newspapers, but you're going to find almost anything you need for business. You're going to find information about records in genealogical databases like Family Search or Ancestry, or online databases, meaning the Library of Congress or the National Archives. Who would have thought that being a tugboat operator, records are in the National Archives? Or ProQuest. Your local libraries and archives and universities will also have information on businesses. I once did a research project for a person whose ancestor worked with Bernard Maybach when the Palace of Fine Arts was being built. And that family story was he worked on the detail for the Palace of Fine Arts. And so I did a lot of research, and then I found out that the UC Berkeley had a lot of records, a lot from Maybach's company. And so I made an appointment to go in and to go through the boxes of information that they had bit by bit. And they actually had not time cards, but payroll records of the people that worked for Maybach, especially during the time the Palace of Fine Arts was created. Now, her ancestor was not one of them. He could have been a day laborer that they, hired. But this is the kind of stuff that universities have. You're also going to find information from businesses through trade association records or the business-related publications like the trade journals or the directories or the company newsletters. You can also get information on where to find a business record by online discussion groups. So that was business records. Just sort of to recap where we find occupations, home documents and artifacts, censuses from 1840 onward, city directories, draft registration cards, military enlistment and discharge papers, newspapers. You can have your articles, your obituaries, your legal notices, your ads. County histories are going to give people's occupations, marriage and death records, tax records and voting records, passenger and naturalization records. And I'd like to just end giving you some things to remember when you're researching these records. First of all, this is going to be very time consuming. The information is not easily accessible, and it's not found in just one place. So you have to be very patient. And you might find that private companies may not grant you access to their records, or they may put obstacles in your way. So you have to be persistent and trying to find as many types of records that'll give you that information. You need to know that context matters. We need to understand the time and the location of your ancestor's life, because occupations and business practices are going to vary greatly depending upon the era or the region or people's local customs. Names can change. Now, I'm not talking about surnames. I'm talking about a job title or a business name, or even the way an occupation is listed. That changes from time to time. So you need to be open to alternative terms that may have been used historically. Don't overlook the small details. Even a minor reference to an ancestor's job in a news article or a vague job description on a census might provide a clue. When you get information, cross-reference it to other information, other sources you have. This is going to ensure accuracy, and it might give you extra clues to find other records. Look for family and community connections. A lot of occupations and businesses were handed down through families. One of my great-grandfathers was a tailor. His father was a tailor, and his grandfather was a tailor. So we know that there was, good chance that you're going to find some tailors in the family. And also look for people, relatives or neighbors or associates that have similar jobs or businesses. Consider occupational changes. Your ancestor may have switched jobs or businesses multiple times over time. And that could happen, due to economic conditions or personal interests or even family obligations. So it might be worthwhile to check what was going on in the country at the time when they switched jobs. Maybe this is what forced them to become somebody else. And lastly, look beyond traditional employment terms. Many ancestors were self-employed or ran small businesses, and they weren't necessarily identified that in censuses. So keep an eye out for indirect references, like small shop owner. That's going to give you a clue that maybe they owned their own business. Now, if you have any questions about today's talk, or if you would like more information on occupations or a specific occupation that your ancestor had, please feel free to contact me at myanov4@gmail.com. Now, before I open this for questions, I just want to give you a preview of next month's part 2 talk. Coming up, we're going to talk about railroad workers, miners, assembly line workers, truckers, garment workers, photographers, partitions, unions, and we'll finally end with farmers. And with that, I'm open to any questions.
Oh, and that talk, just to mention, that talk is going to be January 25th of next month.
Yep. Oops.
Okay,
That's
let's see.
interesting.
Do we have questions? Oh, and I am going to enable you to unmute yourselves so you can ask questions with your own voices as well. Okay, you can unmute yourselves now. Okay, we have link in the chat for part 2. That I'll get that link.
Mr. Munker, this is John here. Can you hear me?
Oh, hi, John. Yeah, go ahead. Ask your question.
I'm pretty new to this ancestry stuff and even using Zoom. So if I push the wrong buttons, please understand. You said that you have a presence on YouTube for the library. Is that correct?
Yeah, I will. I'll post that in just a moment. First thing, I'm gonna post the link to our event calendar for January's talk. So let's see. So
And Madeline, I've found your presentation Interesting. I'm just trying to take notes as fast as I can to search for those sources or to start thinking
Well,
that way. I appreciate it.
well, don't worry because you'll be able to go on the library's YouTube channel and see it all over again. So
No,
if
that's
you
right.
haven't, if you haven't gotten everything you wanted, you get another chance.
And
All
there's
right.
that
So,
link there. There's that link. Also, just search on, if you just go to Google and search Sacramento Public Library YouTube, that brings it up
okay.
too. And there's a whole, there's a lot of stuff there, but if you scroll down just a little bit, you'll see all of the genealogy presentations that are there.
Okay. I'll check that out.
And you got the handout, right?
I don't know how to do that.
Okay,
Uh,
you can email that email address, contact@saclibrary.org,
okay.
and you can get the contact, you can get it that way. What you can also, it doesn't work for everybody, but I post it to the chat, and and most people can download it for there. I understand iPhones and iPads have problems.
Oh, okay.
But you can
All right.
always email me and I'll email it to you at contact@saclibrary.org.
Okay. Thanks.
Sure, you're welcome. Okay, here we have a question. Where did you find the Civil War draft registration roster?
Oh, well, I've actually had that um, for a long time because that was one of my ancestors. But Ancestry has a very good collection of Civil War and registration. So I don't remember. I probably got it from Ancestry a long time ago, but you might want to try there if you're looking for someone that served in the Civil War.
I imagine Family Search probably has that as well, huh?
Yeah, most of them will have the same type of information. In fact, that particular person that registered, John Phelan, um, he registered for the draft and he actually was drafted and he ended up going into the army and he was actually wounded in the Civil War. And the
Here's another,
families,
oh, sorry.
go on.
Oh, I don't want to interrupt what you were saying. There's another question, but you finish what you were saying.
Oh, no, no, no. It was just sort of a just just an observation. He was wounded, and the family story was he was wounded in a place that one never wants to admit that they got wounded.
So here's the next question. Would you start with the county clerk and city archives to see if someone needed a license to sell tobacco or to sell insurance in the late 1880s?
I would definitely do the city and county, yeah. First of all, what you might want to do is find out what the rules were in a particular city or state at that time. A lot of the things that we take for granted now actually were in place in the late 1800s. So if there was a person that was selling tobacco and they had to have a license, let's say in the 1910s, there's probably a good chance that they probably had to have some type of a license or certification to do it in the 1800s. So I would check with the archives, the city archives and the county archives. And then after that, I would check with the Historical Society.
So
I mean, oh, you just remember, peddlers had to have licenses just to, to be a peddler or a tinker. And so they actually did have licenses for just about all different types of occupations back in the 1800s.
I just wanted to mention that the repository for city and county records for Sacramento City and Sacramento County is the Center for Sacramento History. So that would be a good place to check for some of these things that are from that far back locally here. Okay, we're getting lots of thanks from people. What about people who worked for the state of California in Sacramento?
Well, I think you're going to have to wait till next month for that, because one of the things that I will be talking about will be governmental work. And California and the federal government will be mentioned. So come back next month.
And I'm guessing that the California State Library or the California State Archives, both of those are local to us here,
Yeah.
would be good
That
places
would be
to
good
start.
starting points. Yeah.
Hey, any more questions? We got some nice words of appreciation in the chat here. That's always nice. Thank you to everybody. We appreciate you coming.
Well, I understand that this is probably a lot. As I mentioned early, I give a lot of information, but when you sit down and you go through it, I think it's better to have too much information than not enough, because I try to make the talks general enough that anybody who has an ancestor that worked will be able to use something to help them find the information about their ancestors' job. So, as I said, it's a lot of money, or not a lot of money, a lot of information, and a lot of resources, places to go look. It's not just one or two, it's a lot of different types.
Yeah, we appreciate your very meaty presentations. They are full of information.
Well, this one was short. The handout is only 7 pages. I mean, there have been ones that have been 20 pages. So this was a short one.
Well, our speakers often have handouts of just a couple pages, so I think
Yeah.
you're doing quite well. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
Okay. Here we have someone who's heard of Don Hayden has heard about your cold and has some well wishes on that. Or did you mention in the course of your presentation? I don't recall.
I do. I've had this. I'm not even sure it's a cold anymore. The doctors don't even know either. I've had this cough and tickle in my throat for about 2 months. And it gets better, and then it gets worse, and then it gets better. And then if I do a lot of talking, it gets a little bit worse. And I just can't shake it. So I apologize for having to have all those sips of water while we talk about it. I'm not trying to be rude, just trying to be able to continue to talk.
Well, we hope your voice is back at full strength for the presentation in January.
Well, I hope so too. There was one talk that I gave. I was like 5 days out from bronchitis. and I gave a talk to a society, and it turned out fine, but I was just sort of sweating bullets. It's like, am I going to lose my voice? Am I not going to be able to talk? Am I going to be coughing all the time? But it turned out fine, and I'm a lot better today. So it turned out good.
Well, do we have any final questions for Madeline? Okay, some more words of thanks. All right. Well, Madeline, thank you very much for joining us today and for all the information. And everyone who joined us out there, thank you very much for attending.
Thank you.
Okay, well, I'll wrap it up there then. Everyone have a good weekend.